Welcome to the Local Foco Netcast. My name is Timothy Virkkala. I'm here to talk to Ralph Ellis today. We're going to talk about the name of Jesus. So let the lighting of the Local Foco stand for shining light in obscure places in ancient history. But is it obscure? We're talking about Jesus here. We're not talking about Jesus, your gardener, or a baseball player. We're talking about the Jesus of the Gospels. There's been a lot of work done in the last 200 years by scholars trying to make sense of the historical Jesus, they call him. But, that hasn't been a very profitable enterprise. Ralph Ellis has something that breaks it all open, I think, which is why I've asked him here to discuss the name of Jesus. But the first thing I asked Ralph was what has he been up to recently? Online, I'd seen that he'd gone to the Mideast and to look at big stone monuments.
Yes, I did a back-to-back tour of Anatolia and of Egypt. So that was a whole month away. So that was quite an epic little journey. Quite tiring in a way, but very good. I've been to all of those places before, but it was nice to go back because I haven't been back to Göbekli Tepe was one of the main ones we were going to go to. And I've not been there for perhaps 10 years. So it was nice to get back there. Changed completely since I was there. It's now open for the tourists. They've got this big roof over the top of it. The new museum is open in Odessa now. None of that was there when I went. I've been there twice before. And on the last occasion, no, the first occasion I went, it was a bit cold. It was sort of winter. It was completely desolate. I was the only person there. And all of the stones were covered in boxes. So partly, I suppose, against the frost, because they don't want frost shattering, partly against any, local vandals, because, they have idolatrous images all over the stones and so on. So all the stones were there, but they were all covered in boxes. Okay. So I couldn't take any decent photos of them, but there we go.
Were you sort of a lecturer on the tour, or were you?
Yes, I was guest speaker. So they like to have speakers with different viewpoints to the local tour guides, because they have to have a local tour guide. I think it comes with the territory. You've got to have a local, and they will give the standard rationale for all of these places. But they like to have someone that can give the alternate viewpoint as well. So that was my job.
Okay. Anatolia was one place that was, did you go to Egypt? You said Egypt too, right?
Yes, we went down to Egypt after that. So we did the whole tour of Egypt. We did the north and the south, and we did a 4-day boat tour as well on the Nile, which was nice. And you get lots of benefits on these tours. I have to say they're a bit rapid sometimes. So, you do a site in 2 hours, which for me is not sufficient. However, the benefits are you get into places that you would never normally get to. So, we had a private viewing of the of the King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid, which you can never normally get. So it's very, very difficult to get a private viewing into the King's Chamber, and with other sites that you can't normally get into, such as the Assyrian and so on. Right. Which was every time I've been there previously, the Assyrian was always being closed. But anyway, that was open, so that was good.
Right. I'd seen that a number of people like Brian Foster had got special tours into places like that.
Yeah. So we did all of these special tours that you can't really do on your own. So there's benefits to both. It's probably better to do a tour to start with, and then maybe go back to some of the places on your own that you particularly like, because then you can spend all day there. You're not under pressure to move on to the next site. So there's benefits in both.
So did you get to explain to the people that the Giza pyramid was Mount Sinai?
Oh yes, we did a lot of that, and we did a lot of the mathematics and so on of the Great Pyramid. Obviously, all the people going on these sort of tours are expecting some of that material. I mean, that's part of the genre. So, so that wasn't so shocking to them. But a lot of them hadn't heard that. You know, they hadn't actually read my books on that particular subject. This tour was mainly looking at the megaliths, and I don't write about that in my megalith books. That's only in my sort of Old Testament books. So that was new material for some of these people. So that was a little bit shocking for some of them. But of course, it makes logical sense that this was a sacred mountain that was on the way out of Egypt, because when it's describing Egypt, in the works of Josephus, Josephus refers to Egypt as being Thebes in the south. He specifically says that that is Egypt as opposed to the Nile Delta. So if you're coming out of Egypt, then you're going to go up the Nile and you're going to pass by Giza. So it is on the way out of Egypt, as it were.
Did you get to see Akhetaten?
No, we didn't. Very few people go there. I did, when I did the tour myself. Again, that's the advantage of booking things yourself. But that was, gosh, when was that? That was probably 15 years ago. I think I went to Akhetaten. Is the city of Pharaoh Akhenaten. Today it's called Amarna. So if you want to look it up on a map, it's called Amarna. But it's slap bang in the middle of Egypt, and so nobody goes there. I don't think there's an airport there. I certainly didn't see any aircraft flying there. So normally people fly, as we did, from Cairo down to where did we go to? We went to Karnak. And of course, you fly right over the top of Amarna. So really, I think the only way to get there is by train, which is what I did last time. But, you know, if anyone's thinking of doing that, it's a nice journey. Because the trains were so cheap, I got a first-class cabin, which was a cabin designed for 2 people as a sleeper, because it's a night journey normally. You go overnight down there. And so you have your, I forget how long it took. It was about 6 hours, I think. So you have 6 hours sleep and you get up and you're in your destination, which is very nice. And it was a very nice, comfortable train. And there I was in Amarna. And it's difficult to arrange. You have to do that with a tour agent. You're not allowed to go there on your own. So don't expect to turn up at the train station and jump on a train. As a tourist, when you're going to Amarna, you must have security. It's compulsory. So the train journey, I think, was okay. I didn't have security then, but when I got to the hotel, I was forced to wait until security turned up. So we sat there waiting and waiting. And I wondered what, because nobody tells you what's going on. They're all jabbering away in Arabic. And finally, this army personnel carrier came along with a huge, great gun on the top of it. And that was my security to take me down to Akhetaten. So I had a taxi, and then the APC followed behind us with the huge, great gun.
Well, I've seen pictures of Akhetaten, of course, and it doesn't look as spectacular as most of the other things in Egypt, right?
It's mainly made of mud bricks. This is the link we get again with the gospel story that Pharaoh was telling them to make bricks, right. Mud bricks, whether they had straw or no straw. This chimes very, very nicely with the story of the building of Akhetaten, because this was a new city. There was nothing there. It was a barren plain. And Pharaoh, they just don't mention the name of the Pharaoh, but right. Pharaoh was goading on his people to make this new city. So the evil Pharaoh that was making them make the mud bricks, whether they had straw or no straw, was their own Pharaoh. It was Akhenaten himself goading on his people, because they were being used almost like slaves. Recently they dug out one of I wouldn't say the tombs, but a burial pit of the workers, and the majority were young and heavily overworked. You can tell from the state of the bones, that they were undergoing heavy labor because of the way the bones were formed. And the number of broken bones and other things showed that they were having very, very poor conditions and heavy labor and dying young. So really, yes, he was goading on his people to make this new city. And of course they were complaining.
This gets to one of your revisionist theories, is that Akhenaten was not just a pharaoh of Egypt, he was also a descendant of the Hyksos, and also Aaron, maybe? Or your thesis is that it's Aaron, right?
Yes, my thesis is that it's Aaron and Moses are Akhenaten and his brother Tuthmosis. So we have the two brothers in both stories. This is what I call the second Exodus, because if you read Manetho, he's very clear that there were two Exodus events. There was the Great Exodus, that was the Hyksos Exodus, circa 1580 BC. And then we have the Akhenaten Exodus later on, which was circa 1320 BC. So there's a number of centuries between these two Exodus events. And the biblical text has just conflated them both into the same story. But Manetho is clear that there was two Exodus stories. And this was the latter of the two, which he calls the Exodus of the 80,000 lepers and maimed priests. And of course, that's exactly what Akhenaten was. He would have had not real lepers. Josephus makes a big deal of this, saying Jewish priests cannot be lepers because it's forbidden. And you think, come on, bit of lateral thinking here, Josephus. He's talking about theological lepers, not real lepers. And so that's what Manetho is talking about, that there were 80,000 theological lepers and maimed priests, because these were the priests of the Aten, the new god of Akhenaten. And they were banished to the stone quarries on the east bank of the Nile. And of course, if you look at Akhenaten, that's what it is. It's on the east bank of the Nile, and it was a stone quarry because there was nothing there. Everything had to be quarried out of the cliffs on the backside of this plain on the banks of the Nile. And what wasn't being quarried out of the cliffs was being made of mud bricks, because they built this city mostly of mud brick, because it was much cheaper and quicker, of course, to make a city of mud brick than it was to make it of stone. So the only bits of stone, that's why there's not much there now. The only bits of stone are really the pillars for the temple were made of stone. Some little bits of the palace, but most of the palace, I think, was made of mud brick, because most of that is gone. And they had some very good, no, they weren't mosaics. I think they were, what's that style of painting onto plaster? Anyway, it was plaster painting work for the floors and so on, and the walls of the palace, where they have all of these wonderful artistic portrayals of ducks in the marshes and things of this nature. Very realistic, naturalistic portrayals, which is very, very different from normal Egyptian styles of art and artistry, but not very different to the Minoans. I mean, if you look at Minoan art, it's exactly the same. So I can see where he got this idea from. This revolution in artistic styles in Egypt was just borrowing from the Minoans. And of course, at this time, the Minoans had a palace in the Nile Delta. Because of the eruption of Santorini, of course, there were an awful lot of refugees had come out of not only Crete, but also Santorini, where the volcano actually was. All of those people, or rather I should say, well, all of the people in Santorini and a lot of people in Crete were actually pushed out on a sort of exodus themselves. a lot of them ended up in the Nile Delta. And so there was a Minoan palace in the Nile Delta at this time. So and no doubt decorated in the same sort of fashion. So you can see where he got his ideas from.
I'm kind of glad that I asked you about your recent travels, because we got into a subject that interests me a great deal, but not just that. As I mentioned before when I've talked with you, it's always astounded me that I can be told something all my life by scholars that was flagrantly not true. And that there, for instance, is no historical record from the Egyptians of the Exodus. That's something we're just told as a standard truth. And it's repeated by debunkers all the time. You know, atheists, we have a number of our friends in the atheist community who tend to be a little fast and loose with some of their willingness to go after the gods.
I won't go over it in full detail because it'll take too long, but the Hyksos Exodus is exactly the same as the biblical Exodus, you know, apart from these extra bits of Aaron and Moses and so on. The Hyksos Exodus is exactly the same, apart from its dating. It's like 350 years earlier. But you know, very, very quickly, the Hyksos Exodus, they had a leader of theirs was called, or a king or a pharaoh of theirs was called Jacoba. They wore earrings, they were circumcised, they had a war with the Egyptians. There was 3 days of darkness. There was a great ash fall at this time, exactly as it says in the during the plagues. There was a pillar of fire. There was a pillar of dark, a pillar of smoke. There was, what else was there? There was a tsunami, so there was a parting of the waters. As I say, ended up with this civil war with the Egyptians, this battle with the Egyptians, and 500,000 people were kicked out of Egypt, and they went from Pi-Ramesses and they went to Jerusalem. Oh, and on the way, they destroyed Jericho. Now, that is not from the Bible. That is from the history of the Hyksos Exodus out of Egypt. And of course, it's strikingly similar to what we know from the biblical story in everything except the date. So the Hyksos Exodus was about 1580 BC, and the traditional date for the Exodus is the Ramesside period. So we're talking about 1220 odd BC. So there's a 400-year difference, 300-year difference between the two. Apart from that, they're exactly the same. And we can reconcile those dates, of course, if you include the Akhenaten Exodus as being a part of the Exodus story, because the Akhenaten Exodus was about 1320 BC. And so if you amalgamate those two Exoduses into one event, you end up with something that is very, very close to the biblical Exodus.
And I noticed that you pronounced it Hyksos. I think most people pronounce it Hyksos, and you have a reason for that.
Because Manetho gives two pronunciations. He gives Hyksos or Hyksos, depending on how you want to interpret the name. The real name, of course,
is important.
Yes, it is in a way, because one means something to do with slavery. And Josephus says, oh, of course, we were slaves in Egypt. The other one is some other explanation.
Well, I thought it was the shepherd business.
Yeah, but Manetho then gives the original names. He's trying to link up the Hyksos with, because Josephus says that the Israelites were the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt. He calls them our forefathers. And so he's trying to link up the Israelites with the Hyksos by saying, yes, we were slaves in Egypt, etc., and it means slavery and whatever. But Manetho says that it was known, they were known as the shepherd kings. Now, modern interpretations, because the original name was Haikau Kasut, it was not Hyksos, it was Haikau Kasut, which can mean, in modern interpretations, the kings of the mountains, or the foreign kings. That's the sort of modern translation. But if you look at Manetho, who spoke Egyptian, said it means the shepherd kings. And of course, and the name is spelt with the shepherd's crook. So that's a sort of giveaway that he might be correct. And that, of course, links up with the biblical story, because the patriarchs were all known as shepherds. But in this case, they weren't agricultural shepherds. They were shepherd kings, the Hyksos. And Manetho says there are two pronunciations. You can pronounce it as Hyksos or Hyksos, depending on what meaning you want from these this title. But I think in modern Egyptology, they shy away from the shepherd kings because it links up too closely with the biblical story, the Old Testament story of the shepherd patriarchs. And so they say, oh, they were foreign kings because the Hyksos came from abroad. Yeah, but so did the Israelites. You know, the Israelites came out of Haran.
Right.
They came from Mesopotamia. And where did the Hyksos came from? Oh, well, they sort of came from Haran, didn't they? They came from Mesopotamia again. So yes, they do appear to be one and the same people. And Josephus says exactly that. He says that the Hyksos were our forefathers. And again, you won't find that in any reference book even, because it's just not there. And you won't find it in Wiki because they disallowed it. Now, we sat there for about 3 months between me and another chap trying to add that into Wiki. And all we were trying to do was add a one-line reference to Josephus, which literally said that the Hyksos were our forefathers. And it was kicked off. And it must have been kicked off Wiki about 15 times during this, you know, we kept adding it in different forms because they said, you can't do it this way, you've got to do it that way. And so we changed it and put it back in again. And again, it would be deleted until finally we were both kicked off Wiki completely for, what did they call it? For disrupting Wiki or something. We you know, we were a bad influence, and so we were just deleted from Wiki. We were banned.
You're talking about Wikipedia, in case people don't.
Yeah, from Wikipedia.
You like to abbreviate that, and some people don't like to do that.
Oh, okay, right. No, I normally call it Wiki because everything is like it's Wiktionary for the Wiki dictionary and so on.
This all seems actually kind of a preface to what we went through with social media in the last several years. This happened a number of years back, right? And it happened on Wikipedia. I've seen it happen before, that Wikipedia tries to establish an orthodoxy. Their goal at Wikipedia is to keep an orthodoxy about a whole bunch of things going, and apparently this is an important one for them. This business about the Hyksos.
I don't understand how certain people manage to put themselves in positions of power. They did this with the climate debate that I was involved in as well. I don't know if people know, but I'm sort of I'm a climate scientist, and I've written a very influential paper on climate. And they did the same with that as well, because if you want to post anything on Wiki about climate, it has to agree with the standard narrative that we all know. And if you go outside that narrative, it gets deleted, and you get deleted as well. And I've been deleted so many times from Wiki. It's I can't remember how many different names I've had. And somehow within these biblical sides of Wiki, it's been taken over by people with a certain agenda. And that certain agenda is fairly orthodox Judaism and Christianity. And if you don't conform to that, then your addition to Wiki gets deleted.
But most of these people aren't real Jews and real Christians in the sense believing Jews and believing Christians. These are mostly secular people. So they're just like the progressives that have been running Twitter, which we now know quite a lot about.
Yes.
It's an interesting thing how certain types of people just love to get in there with idea power, right? They're trying to make a lock on ideas.
Because in the climate debate, you know, the people deleting this material were not climate scientists, of course. They were ordinary people who were going along with the agenda. And as you say, in the religious debate, these are not necessarily religious people. One of the people was something very strange. He was an atheist or something, but they were still going on with the standard, not agenda, but the standard narrative of the, the gospel story and the Old Testament story. And they would not allow anything, even if it was referenced, because of course with Wiki you can't just put anything on, it has to be referenced.
Sure.
And so you put the reference as Josephus, and they ended up saying, oh, you cannot put anything from Josephus as a reference because Josephus cannot be used as a reference because he's not trustworthy. And you think, hold on a minute, if you look through Wiki, through the biblical side of Wiki, there must be hundreds of thousands of quotes from Josephus Flavius, because he's the only guy who records this history, especially if you're talking about sort of New Testament era. So how on earth can you say that? You can't have a quote from Josephus. But anyway, that's why they deleted us.
Well, this is a great moment to segue to what I asked you here for, which wasn't anything about this, but it's just fascinating. And that is the name of Jesus.
Yes.
You've written 3 books with Jesus in the title, I think it is. Jesus, Last of the Pharaohs, which is the first one I read, King Jesus, and Jesus, King of Edessa. And you have a startling theory to propound in these, and we've talked about it once before. But we haven't really delved into the name of Jesus very thoroughly. And not long ago, this last month, what's his name? Andrew Henry, I believe is his name, who runs Religion for Breakfast on YouTube, which is actually a great channel. He probably gives orthodox and mainstream scholarly thought on religion as well as anyone could hope to express it. And here he does that, in two videos. One about the name of Jesus, and the other about the rather anomalous name that Muslims gave to Jesus. They call him Isa. And so that's a puzzling thing for scholars. That latter especially was puzzling for scholars. But it's not so puzzling if they've encountered your work. And and one of the things that one notices if you're looking at Mr. Henry's videos on the name of Jesus is that he doesn't consult Josephus at all. Josephus has 2 interesting uses of the word Jesus that I can think of. One of them is are the interpolations most people consider fraudulent that were made by monks to put in the a short passage about Jesus being the perfect man, and we can barely speak of him because whatever, that kind of stuff. It's an interesting passage. It doesn't feel like Josephus, but and the other is the talk about Jesus of Gamala and a few other Jesuses during the Jewish wars. And those are 2 Jesuses. That's how they translate it in English as Jesus. And somehow to get to the truth there, Andrew Henry doesn't mention Josephus. Seems like that would be an interesting point of reference. That's all I'm saying.
It would, especially as Josephus did not write in Greek. Now, even this is contentious, but Josephus himself said he couldn't speak Greek very well, which is why he had an interpreter. And he also says that the first books he wrote were all in Aramaic, and they were given to the Babylonian Jews from beyond the Euphrates, which in my books is a reference to Edessa, because Edessa does lie beyond the Euphrates, unlike one of my critics who was trying to look for it on the coast of the Mediterranean. Sorry, no, it's not there. He was adamant that I was wrong. It's on the Mediterranean, he says.
Was he thinking of Amasa, which is right next to Edessa?
No. I forget how he managed. He ended up finding a hotel, which was called the Edessa Hotel on the coast of the Mediterranean. You think, hold on.
Well, there's an Edessa in Russia too, right?
Well, there's an Odessa.
Yeah, well, Odessa, Edessa.
It's almost the same.
Tomato, tomato. Yes. Well, a lot of these names get changed over time, as we find with the standard history of Jesus, the name of Jesus, according to Andrew Henry, and that's what I always learned, was that Jesus's name comes from Yehoshua,
yes,
to Yeshua, And then some trickiness happened as as languages evolve and people shorten things. Well, you call it wiki, not Wikipedia, so why can't it be Isa and not Yahashua?
Yeah, the problem with the Josephus references is they are not the originals. So Josephus was writing in Aramaic, and he clearly says that he could not speak Greek very well. That's why he had the interpreter Epaphroditus, who was helping him later translate these books into the Greek, because he was concerned. He had sent these books to Edessa, the Babylonian Jews from beyond the Euphrates, in order to warn them not to rebel against Rome. This was his Jewish war. So the first copies of the Jewish war did not go to Rome, did not go to Greece, did not go to Judea. They went to Edessa beyond the Euphrates. Later on, he was concerned that people in Rome and various other places were bad-mouthing him, you might say, and giving untruths about the war against the Jews. And so he retranslated the books into Greek. So when we have references to Jesus of Gamala and Jesus of Fires, that would not have been the original text. That's in retranslation. So we don't know how Josephus would have spelt that name in the original Aramaic. I have a suspicion he might have called these people IZAS, and we'll come on to that, or Isa. And so, oh yes, and the other thing with Jesus of Gamala and Jesus of Sapphires is that these are obviously the same person. They're never mentioned together, and they are both governors of Tiberias, who were involved in a war against, a dispute against Josephus Flavius. They were actually fighting against Josephus Flavius. Josephus was the army commander in command of Galilee at the time. So they're quite clearly the same person. And this Jesus was the rebel leader of 600 fishermen. Now, who was the rebel leader of fishermen in this era? I think we sort of can guess who that guy was. So yeah, we have these people who are given the name, the Greek name, Eusus. And the question then is this the original name of that character? Because as you say, that name is taken back into the Old Testament to Joshua, who in the Greek and sort of in the Latin translation in the Vulgate is called, what's he called in that one? He's called Isu in the Greek. This is Joshua. This is the Old Testament Joshua. Isu or Isus or Isun, depending on the declination.
Talking about the Septuagint?
Septuagint, yes, yeah. Which is quite an early translation. So yeah, it goes back to the 3rd century BC, but of course we don't have those manuscripts. The earliest manuscript we've got is 4th century AD. I do wonder if there's been any slight changes to the pronunciations and the spellings of these names. There are snippets of the Septuagint from much earlier, from the 2nd century BC, but none of them include the name of Joshua, because they're literally the little tiny snippets of information from the original Septuagint, which have survived from the 2nd century BC. But none of them have Joshua or Deuteronomy with the relevant parts that would mention Joshua. So we don't know how it was originally spelt in the Greek. But okay, so let's just say that the modern versions, modern 4th century AD, are a good representation of what they were originally. The name for Joshua is Isus or Isu. And the question is then, does the name for my Edessan king match with that? So was the biblical Jesus named after essentially Joshua, the Greek form of Joshua? Or was he named after a retranslation of the name for the Edessan king, which was IZAS? So the name of the Edessan king, this would be from the Jewish war era, the AD 60s, which is when I say that these events took place. His name was, if you amalgamate the two characters involved, is IZAS Manu. Why do I say there's two names? Well, because we have two histories. One is the history of Adiabeni, and one is the history of Edessa. And they are sort of separate. If you read them in the different manuscripts, they are sort of separate, but I don't think they are. And we'll go through this in a minute with the Council of Jerusalem. We know that these two places and these two monarchies are linked because the Queen of Adiabeni was married to the King of Edessa. So we know there is a link between the two. At the very, very least, there is a direct link between these two provinces and these two monarchies. I say they are one and the same, and that Adiabeni is a made-up name by Josephus, because he was not allowed to mention Edessa. And we know that, and we can go through that, how he was not allowed to mention that name. We end up with the king in the AD 60s, the king of Edessa, Adiabeni, was called IZAS, his proper name was Izates Manu, the sixth of Edessa Adiabeni. But of course, Josephus gives him a short name, which is Isa or Isis, depending on the declination, I suppose. And Isa happens to match up very well with the Arabic form. And as that video that you highlighted, I presume you'll probably put it in the references to this video. What does he say? He says that the name of Jesus in the East for the Mandeans was Ishu or Isu. So they didn't even use Eusus, the standard Greek. And the East Syriac version was Ishor. So it didn't have an A on the end at all, or an ayin or whatever. It was Isor, it was their pronunciation, which became Ishu. So there are various pronunciations. The Greek one we get is not, it changes anyway, even in the Greek, depending on the declination. So you can look it up, and you'll get, even for Joshua, you'll get, what do you get? You get Isu, Isun, or Isus, depending on the declination. So there are various pronunciations for this name. And the question then becomes, did the name from Jesus come from Joshua, or did it come from Isis or Isa? My contention is that the name used in the gospel story, in the Greek gospels, is a phonosemantic, I think they call it, which is choosing a name that happens to be similar to the one you're wanting. And in that video you were talking about, with the what's the name of that video, that chap? What are the video names?
The Religion for Breakfast guy.
Religion
Andrew.
for Breakfast, yeah. Very good site, actually. He's got some very good insights into the gospel stories and various other things. He says that in Arabic, they've done exactly the same when they chose the name for John the Baptist. They didn't have the name Yohanan, which I'm surprised about, actually, because the lingua franca of the Arabias at that time was Aramaic. So the name Yohanan should have been around somewhere. But anyway, he says that instead of using John, which is Yohanan, they chose Yehe, which was an Arabic equivalent. It wasn't the same name. It just sounded the same, but it was an Arabic name. And so they chose that. And so they have a different name for John the Baptist. So they didn't try and translate John or Yohanan. They just used an Arabic equivalent.
That happens in names today. I mean, just nowadays, that's what people do. I mean, the similarity. Well, my name, Timothy. I mean, it's Timotheus, right? In Greek. It's not, and my Finnish version is Timo, which is just honor in Greek, but Timo is what they say in Finland. There's no Timothy there. So there's a lot, people do this all the time.
Yes, yeah, they changed the names. And I think that's what happened. I think the name of this character, the Jesus character, was actually Isa or Isis, which was the name in Edessa, as given to us by Josephus Flavius. He gives us this name.
IZAS, or is it IZAS? And this is the Jewish war?
No, I think it's in Antiquities. He gives the history of Adiabene, but of course, as we've explained before, Adiabene is Edessa. At the very least, they are linked provinces, but I think they are the one and the same. And we'll go through why they are one and the same in a minute. So he gives the name of the kings, and the king's name is Izates, except he gives a short name as well, which he shortens the name down. What do you call it? Hypercorosum, I suppose, which is a short name. And he says Isa or Isis. So we actually have the name Isa, but that's the direct equivalent of the Arabic Isa for the name for Jesus. Is exactly the same, and from the same province as well, because remember, Edessa is in Mesopotamia. It's virtually in Arabia.
One of the interesting things Andrew Henry talked about was this discovery of sort of, I say, graffiti, ancient Mesopotamian graffiti in the Black Desert, I guess that is, which would be south of Edessa, right?
Yeah, that's just south of Damascus. Yeah.
Okay, and so they found an Isis, prayed to, or an Isis, something like that. And so this is not, we're talking about next door neighbors here. One of the things I think maybe people who are coming into this for the first time should recognize is that Galilee is where a lot of the action of the Gospels takes place. Jesus is from Galilee. He's called a Galilean. This goes for a long time. At the end of his life, Julian the Apostate allegedly said, "Thou hast conquered, Galilean." So this idea of calling Jesus the Galilean was not an uncommon thing at all. It took place in Galilee, which is east of Judea, right? Judea and Samaria. And the Jewish war took place from Galilee. I mean, that's what much of the Jewish war was. Josephus harassing the people of Galilee because but they were upstarts and so forth, right? So that was where his nemesis, Jesus of Gamala, was.
Yes, Jesus of Gamala was from Galilee. He was the governor of Tiberias. We're talking about the same region, so the guy came from the same part. But also, we have another translation for Galilee, because Jesus and Peter, I think it was, Peter were both called Galileans. But of course, the Galileans were not simply just people from Galilee. The Galileans were the castrated eunuch priests of the Elagabal stone and of Cybele. And we have a great long explanation by Josephus and various other historians about these eunuchs, the Galileans. And of course, Jesus was a Galilean. But, and people won't know this because it's not widely spoken about, Jesus asked for his disciples to castrate themselves.
I remember that quite vividly when I was young and we were studying the Bible, because it came up. You don't not read the passage. It was talked about in church.
Okay, within my schooling, because I went to a Christian Protestant church, and they never mentioned this at all, of course. But this comes from Matthew 19:12, where Jesus says, "There are some eunuchs which are born from their mother's womb, and there are some eunuchs who are made eunuchs by men. But there are some eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it." So here's Jesus asking his disciples to castrate themselves. Now, that might be shocking, but of course, the Galileans were castrato. They were eunuchs. and Jesus and Peter are called Galileans. So the likelihood is that the chief priests amongst the disciples would have been eunuchs. And this is something that we'll come on to in a minute, because this also comes into Arthurian legend. And I know people don't like me talking about Arthurian legend in the same breath, but we also have the cult of the eunuch and the wounded king within Arthurian legend, which we'll come on to again in a minute because it's pertinent to this story.
Things get so stretched here as you're explaining everything, and it let's just say people get a little nonplussed.
Yeah. Without going into it too deeply, do remember that Arthurian legend only sprang out of the Crusades, and therefore they had a lot of material that came out of the Near East. Most of the material within Arthurian legend is all to do with the Near East. The primary hero of Arthurian legend is Joseph of Arimathea. We're talking about an Eastern story in the 1st century. That is the primary hero. So it's not surprising that a lot of the material in Arthurian legend came out of the Near East with the Crusades. But we won't go into that in any great detail because we've got too much else to talk about.
When the subject is so big, where do you start? And just which direction? You can come at it from so many different directions, which is kind of what we're doing here, is that we're concentrating on the name and going from there.
Where I'd like to branch off to, where I'd like to take this on to is the name of Jesus's father, because I think that is interesting as well, because I think we can actually tease out some more information from this than we can about Jesus, which is interesting. I've been looking into this lately because for some reason this question came up a few months ago, and I've been looking into it a bit more. I'll have to write something about this because it's actually quite interesting.
I did ask you a while back. Isn't this?
Yes, it was probably you, but I was busy, so we did nothing about it. That's right.
But it just interested me that Joseph and Josephus, well, that's an interesting coincidence.
Yes, and I think there is probably a link here as well. So the problem from my point of view is if my Edessa connection is correct, then the father of Jesus has the wrong name. So the Jesus character has the right name. So in the gospel story, he's called Jesus Emmanuel. And in Edessa, the name of the Edessan king was IZAS Manu. It's the same name from the same region, pretty much the same era. So that sort of works. But of course, the father does not, because the father of the Edessan king would have been King Abgarus, who is the Agabus from Acts of the Apostles. So he does make an appearance in Acts of the Apostles. We'll go into that in a minute, maybe.
Yeah, but that was with a deliberate parody of a name, right?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. But normally within the Gospels, the father of the Jesus character is called Joseph. And so the question is, why the wrong name? The first reason is that the Gospels were not allowed to mention the Edessan monarchy or Edessa, just as Josephus Flavius was not allowed to mention the Edessan monarchy or Edessa, which is why if you type in any of this to a search function for, either the Gospels or the works of Josephus, it'll just say nothing found. Edessa has been deleted completely from the works of Josephus, even though he knew exactly who these people were, and I can prove that. So that's one reason why King Abgarus could not be in the gospel story. It gives the game away. If you have Abgarus there, you'll know exactly who the Jesus character is, so you can't have that. So they had to change his name. And one of the reasons for changing his name is because these people became proselyte Jews. We get that from the Talmud. The Talmud says that Queen Helena, who was the wife of King Abgarus of Edessa, underwent 7 years of initiation to become a Nazarene Jew. And of course, Jesus was a Nazarene. It specifically says that. Mother and son were both Nazarene Jews. But they were proselytes, they were converts. And so on conversion to Judaism, it's normal to take a Jewish name. And so, yes, he would have taken a Jewish name. So Why not Joseph? But then you might say, well, why Joseph? Why not another name? Well, I think it's because there are similarities here. Because you don't just choose a name just because it sounds nice. You choose it because it has a back history to it that is pertinent to your story, perhaps. It matches you and your personality or your history or whatever, or your goals, in
So we're
life.
talking about Abgaras is looking for a Jewish name.
Looking for a Jewish name. I think the name Joseph was chosen because it came from the Old Testament Joseph. Now, the Old Testament Joseph prophesied that there would be a famine in Egypt, and then he gave famine relief money to save the people of Egypt. Well, King Abgaras did exactly the same. He prophesied, as Agabus and Queen Helena, who did the same, they prophesied that there would be a famine in Judea. And then they sent famine relief money to Judea to help out the people of Judea. This would have been circa AD 48 or up to AD 54 maximum. So AD 50s, which is pertinent because this is the time of the Council of Jerusalem, which we'll talk about in a minute. So they both had the same back history. They were both involved in a famine and saving people from a famine. So the name is a good name for Abgaras or Agabus. Going on much further from that, and nobody else, I think, ever would actually come up with this, because you need to know that this is an Egyptian story that has come out of Egypt. And so continually within the New Testament story, I'm looking back into Egypt, because this is where these people came from. That's why I say that Jesus was known as the Egyptian false prophet. Everyone says, oh, no, they were two completely different people. You think, hold on a minute. No, it was the Egyptian false prophet who took the 5,000 out into the wilderness, as did Jesus. It was the Egyptian false prophet who had the meat. Yes.
I was just reading that passage a few moments ago.
Okay.
Before I called you.
It was the Egyptian false prophet who had the meeting on the Mount of Olives that was disturbed by the Roman guard, the same as Jesus. It just seems, fairly obvious. And so we have these links back into Egypt. Well, when we start looking at the name and the character of Joseph, we start getting more very, very interesting links. Because, of course, the Old Testament Joseph was not called Joseph. Again, we have a change of names. So the name for Joseph was Petaseph.
Okay, where do we hear this?
This comes from, it comes from Manetho.
Okay.
But it comes through Josephus Flavius. So this is quoted by Josephus Flavius. So we're back to our favorite old historian again, Josephus Flavius. And he gives us the Egyptian history of the Exodus. This is where I get my correlation between the Exodus story and the Hyksos Exodus. It comes from Manetho again via Josephus Flavius. It's all part of the same story. So the two heroes of the Old Testament were Moses and Joseph. So Moses was originally called Ososeph or Tisithen, and the name for Joseph was Petaseph. And now you've got to try and translate those names and find out what they mean. Well, luckily, Manetho tells us that Ososeph for Moses means Osiris. It's derived from the god Osiris. So Osar is Osiris. Okay, but what does Ososeph mean? Now you need to look back into the Egyptian. You have to realize, A, that these people came out of Egypt, B, that Joseph and Moses would have spoken fluent Egyptian because they were the prime minister of Egypt and the primary army commander of the Egyptian army was Moses. So they would have spoken fluent Egyptian. And as an aside story, I say that Aramaic is a daughter language of Egyptian. They are the same. So you can see numerous similarities between Egyptian and Aramaic, but that's another aside story. The thing is that they spoke Egyptian. And so if you're going to look at their names, you need to look into the Egyptian for their names. So Osar is obviously Osiris. Seth means the child of, the son of. So Osaseth is the son of Osiris, which is, you know, a standard Egyptian name. So that makes sense. Tisithen, that was more awkward. This is another name for Moses. I think it comes from Gisithen. So instead of a T, it's got a J on the front.
You were confusing me with Asaseth, which sounds an awful lot like Joseph, but you were saying that he was Moses.
That's Moses, yeah. Moses is called Osaseth, according to Manetho. So this comes direct from the works of Manetho. This is his History of Egypt. Remember, Manetho is a 3rd century BC historian who spoke Egyptian. So I think we can take his word that, you know, perhaps these are the proper names, and they mean the right sort of thing when you translate them. So it's not just names plucked out of thin air. Seth means the son of.
Okay.
And of course, that's a standard Egyptian name. Every pharaoh was the son of one god or another, you know, like Ra Moses means the son of Ra. Tuthmoses means the son of Thoth, etc., etc. So it's a name that makes sense. And then his other name was Tisithen. But Gisithen in the Egyptian refers to the red crown of Egypt, the crown of the Nile Delta. And that's where the Hyksos came from, which again sort of makes sense. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. The one we're interested in is Petaseth, which is the name for Joseph. And you can hear on the end of Joseph the same word. It's the Egyptian, of course, because if you look up Joseph in a concordance, for instance, or even actually this is in it's in Genesis, isn't it? It says Joseph means Yahweh has added, because he was the extra son. So if you look into the Aramaic, they're saying that Yosef means Yahweh has added. Yo meaning Yahweh, Seth meaning added. That's the standard Aramaic translation, which is interesting because that's almost right in the Egyptian, because Seth in the Egyptian can mean to multiply, not to add, but to multiply, but, you know, same sort of idea. But in Egyptian, if we retranslate that all from the Egyptian, then Yo, as in Yahweh, is actually the moon god. So his Aramaic name would be the son of the moon, the child of the moon, would be the proper translation of Yosef. So in Manetho, he's not called Yosef, he's called Petaseth. Now, Seth, we already know, means son of. So who is Peta? Peta is Ptah. It's the god Ptah. So the name for Joseph was the son of Ptah, which again is a standard sort of Egyptian name. It makes sense. So yeah, he's called the son of Ptah. Oh, I've got a quote here about Moses from Manetho. Manetho says his name was Osaseth from Osiris, who was the god of Heliopolis. But when he was gone over to these people, the Israelites, his name was changed and he was called Moses. That comes from Against Appian 26. So, you know, this comes out of standard texts. So going back to Joseph, he was the son of Ptah. Now that's interesting because Ptah is the god of architecture, the worker in metals, sculpture, blacksmith, or carpenters. So Joseph, if you know the original name for the Old Testament Joseph, means the carpenter. And of course, the New Testament Joseph was said to be a carpenter. So it looks like whoever wrote this and changed the name and gave Abgarus the name Joseph knew this story in Egyptian very well, because they translated, it's a bastardized name really, because he wasn't really ever called a carpenter. I'm just looking up the reference here. You get two here. Matthew 13:55 says, "Is this not the carpenter," talking about Jesus, "is this not the carpenter's son? Is his mother not called Mary? And his brothers are James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas." Those were the brothers of Jesus. So there, Matthew is saying that the father is a carpenter. And then you go to Mark and it says, "Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? And where are his sisters as well?" So both Jesus and Joseph were both known as carpenters. They were the son of Ptah, the son of the architect, because Jesus and his father were not called carpenters. On both occasions, they are called a tekton in the Greek, which I suppose can mean carpenter if you stretch it a little bit. But the name as we know it today comes down as an architect. You can still hear it in the word architect. An architect or an architecton is a chief architect, a chief, mainly a stonemason.
But we also get a master builder as well. A master builder.
Yeah, master builder, master technologist. We still have the same word in technology as in tekton. So yeah, a master builder, an architect as we would know it, someone who designs buildings, but also a speculative architect, a Freemason. So a Freemason in Greek today is an eleftherotekton, a Freemason. And I think that this architecture carpenter business is not talking about an operative tekton, an operative mason. It's talking about a speculative one, a Freemason. And so Jesus would have been, and his father would have been, Freemasons in the 1st century. And we sort of know this is true because the raising of Lazarus is a 3rd degree raising. It's exactly the same as I went through when I became a master mason. It's the same. You die, you're put into a grave, and you're resurrected on the 3rd day, or perhaps the 4th day, and you're resurrected and you're pulled back out of the grave while you're hoodwinked, which is exactly what happens to Lazarus in the Gospel of John.
And when you say hoodwinked, you mean specialized meaning to that?
Yeah, he has a covering over his face. Right. So to hoodwink is a Masonic term, meaning your head is covered with a hood, so you cannot see what's going on. And it's sort of, I suppose, like a burial shroud, but it's mainly for your head, and so you are hoodwinked. To wink means you close your eyes, as in to wink at someone, you close your eye. So to be hoodwinked means your eyes are closed by a hood. So you're hoodwinked. But Lazarus comes out of the grave in exactly the same fashion. He is hoodwinked when he comes out. And so it's quite clear that Jesus and his father Joseph were both Freemasons from a very early Freemasonic lodge. Now, that shouldn't be too surprising. I mean, they say that Masonry only came out of, the founding of Grand Lodge in 1713. Grand Lodge in London. But of course, Freemasonry goes back way beyond Grand Lodge, goes back through the Knights Templar. And the actual history of Freemasonry goes back to the building of the Temple of Solomon. So that is the primary theology, as it were. I mean, it's not a religion, but the primary theology of Freemasonry is the construction of the Temple of Solomon by Hiram Abiff. And it was Hiram Abiff, the builder, the architect of that temple, who was killed and put into a shallow grave, and he lay there for 3 days until they found him, and then they resurrected him by pulling him out of the grave via the lion's grip, and he came back to life again. And that is the story of Freemasonry. That is the story of the raising of Lazarus. It's the same story. So it's not surprising that this history may have been around in the 1st century. Not too surprising at all, especially if the Jesus character was not just a simple carpenter, but was actually a prince of Edessa. He was King or Prince IZAS or Prince Isa, which is the name for Jesus, as we've said, in Mesopotamia.
He was also the governor of Tiberias.
Yeah, so we have these 2 stories. This happens a lot in Josephus. So if you read Josephus, he didn't write this story. It's quite obvious that he had a load of editors, and they were all collecting information from different chronicles and assembling them into this book. And some of them didn't quite go in the right order, so you get chronological dislocations because they didn't quite know where this story should fit. And sometimes the stories use different names because, well, you know, the original text that came in had a different name, so that's what they used. And so we had these different names for this separate story. So we get 2 stories of an exodus out of Parthia, out of Persia. We get the Babylonian Jews from beyond the Euphrates. And then we get the story of Queen Theomusa Orania, who also came out of the east and ended up in Syria somewhere. I say these 2 stories are linked. And then so we get 2 stories about people who were the leaders of the Jewish revolt. So all of this story, all of these different aspects of this same story all come back to the Jewish revolt era. And so if we're looking at the Jewish revolt, the leader of the Jewish revolt was the King IZAS, King Isa Manu of Edessa. He was the leader of the Jewish revolt. Jesus of Gamala and Saphias, he was the leader of the Jewish revolt. Bar Kamsa, who is on the Hakok mosaic, I'm not sure if we've discussed that before.
We did.
We did, yeah. He was the leader of the Jewish revolt. So all of these characters suddenly come together as being the leader of the Jewish revolt. And this is one of the methods and reasons why we can amalgamate these characters and say that IZAS was the Jesus character who was known as Jesus of Gamala, Jesus of Saphias, because the Edessan princes didn't stay in Edessa. They were quite obviously farmed out, and it specifically says that they were sent out to different places. Well, A, for their education. You know, the Jesus character went to Egypt for his education, so that's quite clear. But also, I think they were sent out to govern city-states while they were not king. So as a method of education, I suppose, you know, while you're a prince, you go off and you become the prince governing a principality or a city-state or something. And I think they were doing this, and so people were sent out, you know, maybe to Palmyra, maybe to Hatra. There are big similarities with Hatra. I'm still sorting out the similarities with Emesa, which you mentioned, and also down to Tiberias, because this guy called Jesus of Gamala Saphias, who was the rebel leader of 600 fishermen, so we know who that was. He was the governor of Tiberias in Galilee. And he was the guy who owned the Zodiac on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, the Hamat Tavera Zodiac, which has more links back to Odessa and so on.
Isn't Tiberias close to the traditional location of Nazareth?
Well, Nazareth did not exist in this era. I'm one of these heretics who say that Nazareth did not exist because there is no mention within the Old Testament of anywhere called Nazareth. And it specifically says in the gospel story, I'm just going to bring up this because, oh, it would help if I spelt it correctly. Because this is a contentious element. It's specifically saying that he was a Nazarene. So this comes from, well, we got two references, Matthew 2:23 and Acts 24:5. Now, let's start with Acts 24:5, which is talking about Saul, St. Paul. And it says, for we have found this man a pestilent fellow, which is a good description of Saul, that's for sure. And a mover of sedition amongst all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarene. And by sect, it means it is actually called heresis, a heresy in the Greek, the heresy of the Nazarene. So we know that the Nazarene was a religious sect.
That's clear in Josephus as well.
Yes, yes, indeed.
But only in the Antiquities.
In Antiquities, yes. I'm pretty sure it's in Antiquities. We can look at that in a minute. But then Matthew 2:23 says about Jesus, he came from Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophets, that he shall be called a Nazarene. So they're deliberately manipulating what it was said by the prophets in the Old Testament because he had to be called a Nazarene. But it's quite clear that it's talking about the religious sect, not the town. And they're just using that town to cover up that he was of the sect of the Nazarene. And the Nazarenes were the Nazarites from the Old Testament. Again, a lot of people find that contentious, and I'm not sure why, because I think it's pretty obvious myself. If you look in the Old Testament, they had the sect of the Nazarite, and they have the same meaning. So the Nazarene, it comes out of Nazareos, the Nazarene. It means to separate yourself. And by separate, it means, I think what it's actually referring to is something like a monk, a monastic life, or maybe a hermit or something of that nature. Probably actually more like a monk, because I'm thinking here of the Essene, who separated themselves off from Jerusalem and it ended up down at Qumran on the shores of the Dead Sea, separated off from society. And that's how you could interpret the Nazarene. Well, the Nazarite were the same. A Nazarite means to separate, from Nazir in the Aramaic, to separate yourself off. It means the same thing. And of course, the Nazarite were not allowed to pull their hair, as it says in the King James. They could not cut their hair. And that's why when you look at the image of Jesus, he has long hair and a beard. That's why when you look at the Edessan monarchy, they have long hair and a beard. And that was not usual for Romans and Greeks, who were often clean shaven. And Josephus makes a thing of that because he calls them barbarians. And again, I go out, I wouldn't say even out on a limb. I think, you know, this is off on a very firm branch, I think, not a limb, because everyone says, oh, you're completely wrong. A barbarian refers to language. someone who cannot speak your language. Bar, you can't speak the same language. This is where barbarian comes from. And I say, no, not at all, because Josephus calls the Edessans, the Babylonian Jews from beyond the Euphrates, he calls them barbarians. Yeah, but that can't refer to language, because the Babylonian Jews were speaking Aramaic, and so were the Edessans. The language of Edessa was Aramaic. So it cannot refer to language. It must refer to hair, because barber means hair, as it does in the English. You know, when you get your hair cut, you go to a barber. From barbarian, he must be referring to long hair, and that's what he was making fun of, that the Edessans had long hair and long beards, which they did. You can see that on all of their mosaics and on their coinage. They all have long hair. And yeah, a lot of Jews would have had long hair, but Josephus, being a Romophile, would not have. He would have been clean shaven. A bit like that statue that we always see of Josephus, which is not confirmed to be Josephus, and they get very upset if you mention this. It's in a Danish museum, and if you dare say it's Josephus, they'll start jumping up and down saying no, we only think it's Josephus. It has no direct attribution to it saying this is Josephus. But anyway, that's how Josephus would have looked, with a Jewish nose, but clean shaven, because he was a Romophile.
But didn't the Pharisees, and he calls himself a Pharisee, as does Paul, didn't the Pharisees also clip their hair up or shave it up on the top, but then grow their beards long? You're
correct, because the original from the Old Testament, it says that to be a Jew, yes, you shave the top of your head, but leave the sideboards long and the back long, which is why when you look at a traditional sort of Orthodox Jew, that's what you have. You had the curly side locks of hair with long sideburns, as it were, and long hair at the back, shaven on the top. So we were talking about the hirsute Nazarene. They have lots of hair. So yeah, that's a peculiarity of the Nazarene, which sets them apart. And that's why Josephus was making fun of them. And I might as well just show an image, I suppose, if I can do a share screen. Is that allowed?
Yes.
Let's share that screen. And we should now see the Hakok mosaic. This I have labeled as being the king of Edessa. Anyone who wants to go into this in detail, I think we did a talk on this a while back, so they can join in and have a look at that. But this guy here is not Alexander the Great, as someone said, one of the archaeologists said. This is Bar Kamsa from the Talmud, and Bar Kamsa is the leader of the Jewish revolt. And of course, the leader of the Jewish revolt were the kings and princes of Adiabeni. And of course, the kings and princes of Adiabeni were the kings and princes of Edessa, because they had the same mother, Queen Helena, who was the queen of Edessa and the queen of Adiabeni. So this guy is a king of Edessa. This is IZAS. This is the guy we've been talking about. This is King IZAS, or Isa Manu of Edessa, from the AD 60s. And this event is actually AD 65. So we can date this fairly accurately, because he's giving a sacrificial calf to the high priest of Jerusalem in order to start the Jewish revolt. So we know this era very precisely. And of course, we were talking about hair. Well, let's zoom that out a little bit. We're a bit too close there. And that's exactly what this guy has. He has long hair, a beard, and he has a curly side lock of hair, because he is a Nazarene Jew. This is why we know this is not Alexander the Great. He would not have worn a curly side lock of hair. And so, yeah, he is hirsute. He is a barbarian, as Josephus liked to take the mickey out of him and call him a barbarian. And for those of you, just while we're on the subject, Queen Helena of Edessa became the queen of Judea. We know that because she had the largest tomb and the largest palace in Jerusalem. This is her tomb. It's known as the Tomb of the Kings down in Jerusalem, but it was actually the tomb of the Edessan Adiabeni royal family. Just been reopened. I've never been able to go into it. It's been closed for years and years. It's been closed, but they've done some renovations on it, and they've now allowed people in. So I must go back and have a look at some point. So this is their tomb. It's just north of the north gate of the old city of Jerusalem. And I did have a picture of her palace, which is just to the south of the temple platform in Jerusalem. Anyway, so that's a quick picture there of the king of Edessa.
Now, you said, well, this would be King IZAS Manu's mother is Helena, but
yes,
that's not Mary. Mary is the name given in the Gospels.
Yeah, again, we have a different name there, but I think we can tell from the number of Marys, there was about 5 of them at the crucifixion, that Mary is not a name as such. It's probably a title. And I think it comes from the Edessan name for a priest, which is Ma or Mara for a female. And so I think it's just referring to Mary, the mother, being a priestess, which we knew that they were. We know that because Mary Magdalene anointed Jesus with spikenard oil, which is a significant event, which is not talked about very much or enough, because that is how you make a Christ or a Messiah. The Christ or the Messiah is the anointed one, anointed with oil, in this case of spikenard. So this was a very important little ceremony. It was the anointing of the next king of Edessa, Judea. And okay, this wasn't done in a temple or a palace because Jesus wasn't there at the time. It was done at the house of Simon. Although I imagine it was fairly palatial because this would have been Simon Boethus, who was the richest man in Judea. So I think it would have been a fairly substantial property because Jesus and Mary lived at the house of Simon, of course. And she anointed him with oil so that he could become the Christ, the Messiah, the anointed priest king of Judea, of the Jews. And so for her to do that, she must have been a priestess. Only a priestess would have been able to anoint Jesus as the next king, priest king of Judea. And so this is when Jesus became the Christ. And it means that Mary must have been a priestess, which we sort of knew anyway. So yes, she would have been a Mar. She would have been a Mara, a priestess in the Syriac, in the Aramaic. All of the priests in that region were called Mar something. So I think that's what they were talking about. And while we're talking about these links between Edessa and the gospel story, it's probably worth talking about the Council of Jerusalem and what happened at that point, because I think we can see more links here between the gospel story and Edessa. And so what is the Council of Jerusalem? Well, if people haven't heard of this before, it comes from Acts chapter 15. And it details the conversion of a group of people in Antioch to Judaism. And so these people in Antioch were being converted to Judaism, and there was a dispute as to whether they should be circumcised or not, because Saul, ever the moderate, was saying, no, they don't have to be, while Peter and various others, well, it wasn't only just Peter, were saying, yes, you have to be circumcised. And this story gets repeated 5 times in 5 different texts, which is interesting because then we can make some comparisons between the two. So we have the story in Acts, which is about Antioch going, these apostles going to and from Antioch, from Jerusalem to Antioch and back again, with this problem of the conversion of the people of Antioch. Now, do remember that Edessa was called Antioch. It was called Antioch Edessa. A lot of these cities gained the name Antioch from Antiochus, the Greek king of this region during the Seleucid era. And Edessa was called Antioch. So are we talking about the standard Antioch? I mean, if you're talking to a theologian about this, they'll say it's Antakya, which is on the Mediterranean coast, which was called Antioch. But no, I think this is all talking about Edessa. And we know that because we have the same story from Antiquities, from Josephus Flavius, book 20. And in this story, we have Ananias, who is the moderate, who goes up to Adiabene. And of course, we've already said that Adiabene and Edessa are the same place. And he's the moderate, and he's saying to the king, because this is all about the conversion of the king of Adiabene Edessa to Judaism. So again, it's about conversion. And remember that Adiabene is Edessa, and Edessa is called Antioch. So they're going to the same place. They are going to Antioch. So we have Ananias that goes up there, and he's the moderate, and he says, no, 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 you don't have to be circumcised. And then the hardliner, the fundamentalist, who's called Eleazar, he goes up to Antioch Edessa and says, no, you need to be circumcised. And the queen, who is the mother of IZAS, Isa, she is concerned because she thinks there will be opposition from the population, and their nation might become a wasteland if they go ahead and convert to Judaism and get circumcised. So there's 2 stories that are the same. We have people going from Jerusalem to Antioch. Antioch is Edessa, trying to convert not just the people now, but the monarchy, the king, to Judaism. And we know that the Edessan monarchs did convert to Judaism because the Talmud says so. And there's a dispute as to whether they should be circumcised or not, and a problem of will the people accept it if they do become Jews and get circumcised? You know, will there be a revolt? Well, in fact, there was a revolt. We'll come on to that in a minute. So that's 2 versions. Then we get the same story in the Doctrine of Addai. And the Doctrine of Addai is about Edessa. It's a story about Edessa. And this time, the people shuttling backwards and forwards were Hanan and Mar-Ihab, again, that name Mar, priest, Mar-Ihab and Shamshagram. Again, it's the same story. It's because the king had an infirmity and they're sending ambassadors down to Jerusalem to go and see Jesus and meet with Jesus, etc., and trying to get a cure for the king. So again, the king is infirm for some reason, probably because of circumcision. And the person going down there is Hanan, whereas in Antiquities, the person going there was Ananias. Hanan, Ananias. And then we get the same story in Moses of Corine. He's a Syriac historian. And again, it's a bit of a copy of the doctrine of Addai, this one. But the ambassador that's shuttling backwards and forwards now is called Anan, Ananias, Anan, Hanan. It's obviously the same story. And again, the other ambassadors are called Ma-ihap this time, not Ma-ihab, but Ihap. And Chamchagram, which is obviously Shamshagram. It's obviously the same name. And again, because the king of Edessa had an infirmity that they were trying to communicate with Jesus. And then we get the same story in Arthurian legend. Oh, sorry, chaps, we're back to Arthurian legend again here. But again, the whole point of the story of Arthurian legend is that the king had been wounded between the thighs. He was known as the wounded king. It's obviously something to do with either circumcision or castration, because we were talking about the cult of castration. So the king again had an infirmity. He was wounded between the thighs, and they were worried that the nation would become a wasteland. In fact, the nation did become a wasteland because of this king being the wounded king, because he had been wounded between the thighs. And the whole point of Arthurian legend is trying to cure the wounded king of his wounds so that the land could be restored, which is exactly the same story as in Acts and Antiquities and everything else. So it's quite obvious that all of these versions of the Council of Jerusalem were talking about Edessa. What they were trying to do is convert not just the people of Antioch Edessa, but convert the royal family, because they wanted influence. And that desire for influence probably went both ways. The Jews were obviously trying to evangelize, which is why, people like Saul and Barnabas were sent out, across the Mediterranean, not simply evangelizing for Judaism, but for Nazarene Judaism. And the Edessan monarchy wanted influence because they wanted to become influential in the whole of the Levant, the whole of the Roman East. If they could become the kings of the whole of the Roman East, they would become quite powerful. And that's why Queen Helena was down in Judea, becoming the queen of the Jews, the queen of Judea, with the largest palace and the largest tomb in Jerusalem. And in order to do so, they would have to convert to Judaism. And so we get these stories about what's going to happen if they do convert. We get two stories in Acts of the Apostles about this. And the first bit is about Emesa, the dangers of conversion to Judaism. Izates, who is the king of Edessa, of course, had a desire to leave the religion of their country. This is a quote from Josephus. And to embrace the customs of the Jews. But the grandees were angry and wished to inflict a punishment upon him. And so they wrote to King Abia, the king of the Arabians, and promised him a great sum of money if they would make an expedition against their king, against the king of Edessa, who's King Abgarus. This is talking about Adiabeni, Edessa. And so the king was Abgarus Monobazus, was his two names. And so again, we have the royal family changing to Judaism, but the grandees, the aristocrats, were angry because they were afraid that the people might rebel. And so they are going to King Abia, the king of the Arabians, and trying to ally with him in order to defeat and dethrone the king of Edessa, Adiabeni. So this was the problem. If you change your religion, well, maybe you're going to lose your throne as well. And we know this is talking about, in this case, Messa, because the king of the Arabians, and of course, this is not Arabians at all. Again, they love this wordplay. When they're talking about Arabians, they're talking about locusts. All of these people were known as locusts. They weren't from Arabia at all. We're actually talking about Emesa here. And so the Emesa was another principality just south of Edessa. It's around Homs and Hammer, which is just south of modern Damascus. And they had another royal family down there, which were the kings, the monarchs of Emesa. And we know they are talking about Emesa because they went to Ashmesh. I can never pronounce this. They had a fortress at Ashmemis. Ashmemis. There we go.
I can
and
see
they
why you have trouble.
Yeah. So they shut themselves into this fortress, and they were besieged by the Edessan king. This is how we know, another reason why we know this is not talking about Adiabeni, which is supposed to be down in Iraq at Mosul. It's talking about Edessa, because the Edessan Adiabeni king is now fighting against this other king, and they go to the fortress at Shmemis. Well, this is one that we do know, so we know where Shmemis is. And of course, it's next to Homs and Hammer. It's the principality of Emesa. So let me do a quick share screen, because this is a marvelous place. I've never managed to get to this place, actually, because they always keep fighting in this region. And so it's very difficult to get to. But this is the fortress of Shmemis. And what a fortress that is. This is next to Homs and Hammer, and it's an old volcano. It's a real volcano, which they've turned into a fortress. And it is the fortress of the Emessan monarchy. So who's going to be fighting against the Emessans? Well, of course, it's the Edessans, who live just north of here, just north of Aleppo, in modern Sanliurfa, they call it, Edessa. And so this was a family infight, because I'm sure there were family links between the Edessans and the Emessans. There are too many links between these monarchies for them to be entirely separate. They have to be linked. And so the king of Edessa went down to this fortress and defeated Abia, the king of, which must have been the Emessans. And so now we know who Abia was. The king, if we know their king list properly, the king of Emesa at this time was called IZAS. Now there's a there's a familiar name for you. So the king of Edessa was called Isa or IZAS, and the king of Emesa was called Azizas. There has to be a family link here, doesn't there?
It certainly looks like it, sounds like it.
It certainly sounds like it. I don't think this is the same person. There are too many differences between these two monarchies for them to be the same person. It has to be two monarchs with similar names, because they were probably related in some fashion. And Azizas, if you read it in Wiki, I've been trying to change Wiki without getting kicked off the site again. But if you read the Wiki site on the Emessan monarchy, they will say that Azizas was an Arab because he has an Arabic name. Well, Azizas is not an Arabic. Well, they also say Abia is an Aramaic name, is a Arabic name, but Abia is Aramaic, of course. There was a king, I think, called Abia. Solomon's son was Rehoboam, and Abia was the son of Rehoboam, who was the king of Israel. So Abia is a well-known Aramaic name. It's not just Arabic. And IZAS translates very nicely in in Aramaic as well, meaning strong or powerful, which was the translation I gave for Izates as well, IZAS, the king of Edessa. IZAS in Aramaic means strong or powerful. And so it's a common name that you would expect for a monarch. And so quite obviously, these were not, they keep trying to translate from Arabic because Josephus and other people say that these were, that these monarchs were Arabic, they were Arabians. But of course, Arabic is just this nickname they give people because it means locust. It doesn't mean that they were Arabians. I think that they were, well, they were the same as the Edessans. They were Egypto-Jews who had come out of Parthia, who had settled in Syria, and they were using pseudo sort of Aramaic names, because remember, Aramaic was the lingua franca of Mesopotamia at this time. It had been for at least a century. The language of Mesopotamia had been Greek ever since the campaigns of Alexander the Great. But the Greek started to fade out in the 1st century BC, and it was being replaced by the Parthian language because they were now Parthians. But the Parthian language was not liked. A lot of people said it was very limiting. And so the lingua franca of Mesopotamia became Aramaic. And that's why these kings have these Aramaic names. So IZAS was the king of Emesa from 42 to 54, according to most texts. So we're talking about the right time, because remember the Council of Jerusalem was supposed to be about AD 50 to AD 54, some people say, which I would agree with. And it's talking about the same thing. So we have another, if we can just continue with this, we have another account from Josephus that's talking about the same thing. It's talking about the conversion of the Adiabeni Edessan royal family. And this version says, when Izates, that's IZAS, the guy of Edessa, was at Charax or Charax Spasni, which we might discuss later. So while he was away from his lands, a Jewish merchant called Ananias got among the royal women. Again, that same name again, Ananias, Hanan, Anan, it's all the same story. So he got among the royal women and taught them to worship the God according to the Jewish religion. Again, we're talking about the conversion of this royal family to Judaism. Moreover, he persuaded Izates to embrace that religion. When he saw that his mother, Queen Helena, was highly pleased with the Jewish customs, he made haste to embrace them entirely, because he could not thoroughly become a Jew unless he was circumcised. But Queen Helena endeavored to stop him. She said that this thing would bring him into danger among his subjects, because they would never bear to be ruled over by a Jew. So the king at that time complied with these persuasions of Ananias, Ananias being the moderate who says, you don't need to be converted. Ananias, if you think about it in biblical terms, in terms of the Acts of the Apostles versions, is the Saul character. He is the moderate who's saying, like Saul did, you don't have to be circumcised. This is all about faith, you know, don't worry about the Mosaic law. You don't have to be circumcised, because Saul was teaching this proto-Christianity, you could call it, Judaism for Gentiles. But then it continues and it says, but afterwards another Jew came out of Galilee whose name was Eleazar, and persuaded him to do the thing, to become circumcised. So again, we're talking about the conversion of this royal family and their circumcision. When the king, this is IZAS, heard what Eleazar said, he sent for the surgeon. And he told his mother and Ananias, his tutor, that he was circumcised. Upon which they were struck with astonishment, and lest this thing should be discovered, and the king should hazard the loss of his kingdom, because his subjects would not bear to be governed by a man who is so zealous in another religion. And that's why his aristocrats, as we saw in the previous quotation, went to King IZAS of Emesa, IZAS of Emesa, in order to overthrow the king. Note they're talking here about IZAS and not the father, Abgarus, because there is confusion on to when this happened, whether it happened before AD 50 or after AD 50. There are two conflicting versions. So if you read Acts of the Apostles, it has the famine and then the Council of Jerusalem. And if you read Josephus, we have the Council of Jerusalem and then the famine afterwards. So we have two chronologies. So it's very difficult to find out exactly what happened. But of course, this is exactly what Arthurian legend is talking about, that the king became circumcised or castrated and was threatened with the loss of his kingdom. It's the same story. So we have 5 different versions of this Council of Jerusalem. And the interesting thing is it's linking Adiabene with Edessa, because we have the story from both cities. Josephus is talking about Adiabene, but the doctrine of Addai and Moses of Corine are both talking about Edessa. So again, we have that link. And it links Edessa with Acts of the Apostles, because Acts of the Apostles is talking about the same story. And more than that, the ambassadors that are running backwards and forwards between Edessa and Jerusalem are Saul and Barnabas, and Peter, of course, and Judas, Barsabbas, and Silas. They are the apostles, the biblical apostles, and they are going backwards and forwards from Antioch, Edessa to Jerusalem, talking about the conversion of the royal family to Judaism and their circumcision. It's the same story.
And so
but
what
it
you're
means that the gospel story came out of Edessa, because that's where Saul and Barnabas came from. They were ambassadors of Edessa.
They're sort of buying into Judaism in part to get a hold on Jerusalem. Is that how you look at this?
Yeah, and they use the famine to do likewise, because linked to this, as we've just said, was the famine story. And this comes from Acts of the Apostles again, Acts 11:28. And it says that there stood up a prophet whose name was Agabus, which is obviously King Abgarus of Edessa, and signified that there would be a great famine throughout the world, which would pass in the days of Claudius Caesar, which basically is around AD 50-ish, something of that nature. And then the disciples, every man according to his ability, determined to send famine relief to the brothers down in Judea, which they did, and they sent it by the elders. Sorry, they sent it to the elders by the hands of Saul and Barnabas. So again, we know this famine relief came from Queen Helena, because Josephus Flavius says so. We know that Queen Helena was married to King Abgarus, because the Syriac historians say so. So we know that this famine relief money was coming from the royal family of Edessa. And it was sent to Jerusalem by the hands of Barnabas and Saul and Barnabas, the very same people that we've seen in the Council of Jerusalem, who were shuttling backwards and forwards from Edessa to Jerusalem. It's part of the same story as, not as Acts says, because Acts of the Apostles sort of separates the two, but as Josephus Flavius says, that they were part and parcel of the same thing. Immediately after this Council of Jerusalem, according to Josephus, Queen Helena goes straight down to Jerusalem with famine relief money. That is the very next thing in the very next paragraph. And so the famine relief money was linked to this Council of Jerusalem. And as you were saying, it's both of them are a method of taking over Judea. So Council of Jerusalem says they are converting to Judaism, which they do. Famine relief money means I come down into Judea with oodles of money to give to the temple, to give to the people, to give famine relief money. And everyone will be saying, heaven be praised to Queen Helena of the Adiabeni for saving us from famine. How better a way of becoming the influential royal, the Queen of Judea. And then, of course, she builds the largest palace in Jerusalem and the largest tomb in Jerusalem, and she furnishes the Temple of Jerusalem. So it was Queen Helena who bought the solid gold menorah for the temple. The most expensive artifact in the whole of the temple was bought by Queen Helena of the Adiabeni. What better way through your largesse to become the Queen of Judea, the de facto Queen of Judea?
And to
and
give
then, of
her
course,
son,
her son.
Yes.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, just to say the same thing you were going to say. And her son, therefore, has a huge claim to the whole of the region.
Yeah, and becomes the king of Judea, or the king of the Jews, as he's titled in the New Testament story, because his mother was the queen of the Jews. And this was the whole political design. It's not just simply religious, it's very much political. I want to take over this region. I want to become more influential. We've got the money to do it. How do we do it? Well, we placate these people by adopting the same sort of religion, and we give them heaps of money so that we become influential. And they did. They took over that region. And the whole point of doing so was not to take over Judea. The whole point of doing so was to take over Rome, because at this time, the throne of Rome became empty. So AD 66, everybody knew. So we're moving on 10 years now from Council of Jerusalem was AD, let's call it AD 54. That's the sort of general, and I would agree with that date. It works very well in my chronology. And so this design had been in from the early AD 50s. So it had gone on for more than 10 years until we get to AD 66, when they could put it into action. And what happened in AD 66? Well, everybody knew that Nero was on his last legs. Everyone knew that he was a dead man walking from AD 66 onwards, from after the death of Poppaea, which Josephus might have been involved in. I'm not sure if we talked about this, but Saul and Josephus went to Rome in AD 62. Yep.
My dog, I don't know if you can hear the dog is barking. I need to let him out of the room.
No, we can't hear him now, so you're okay there.
Okay, yeah, he'll come back up. He may even come back barking because he really wants to be let out of the house. There are important vehicles to bark at outside, so.
Right. Oh, for a dog's life, eh?
Yeah, well, he has one job, as far as he's concerned.
Bark at cars.
Exactly. And wildlife at night, he likes to do that too. We have bears and elk and all sorts of things close by here. So.
Oh yeah, we don't get many of those in southern Britain or mid Britain.
No, I suppose not. You're in mid Britain, is that the area?
Yeah, Cheshire.
Cheshire. Okay, so you're not out. You're not down there in Cornwall, which is the Arthurian part of England that I think of. But
yes. Well, actually, we must run through this because I say that Arthur ended up in Cheshire.
Oh, I know.
Cheshire,
We've talked about it before. It's oh right. That was Derry.
In Fortress Dewa. So yeah, but that's another story.
That's another story. Okay, let's get back to where you were. Sorry.
Yeah, back to Josephus. Josephus and Saul, which is one of the reasons why I say they're the same person, both ended up in Rome in AD 62, 63, on this ship that got shipwrecked, and they got taken to Rome to go and see Nero. Well, Josephus became a confidant of Poppaea, the wife of Nero, one of the favorites of Poppaea. And Poppaea had a proclivity for young men. And of course, Josephus would have been a young man at this time. He would have been 25, I think, something of that nature. And so then Nero kicks Poppaea to death by kicking her in the stomach, which is sort of an indication that she was probably pregnant. And so what does Josephus do? Well, he thanks Poppaea for all the presents and skips off back to Judea again. You think, hold on a minute.
Josephus, meanwhile, Nero had a thing about Christians at the time. Let's call them Christians.
Yes, a little bit. Yep. Here's Josephus, who was the favorite of Poppaea, doesn't mention her death at all, just skips off back to Judea, and you think, could he have been involved here somewhere? Well, I think possibly. So there's another intrigue for you.
Well, there's a lot of them in Josephus. Sometimes what he doesn't mention are the clues to what he's talking about. Well, it is also worth, I mentioned that last time we talked, it is interesting that Epaphroditus is the same name of the guy who was his assistant, is also the guy who actually slayed Nero. That's
right, yeah. So
there's nothing there. Obviously, nothing's happening there. No.
Yeah, got to be different people. Yes, what would you call him? The publisher, I'll call him. The publisher of Josephus and the publisher of Saul were both called Epaphroditus. And the guy who killed Nero was called Epaphroditus, who was a publisher. He was a scribe of the royal court. And you think, yeah, that's interesting.
It is very interesting. But we get to this naming issue. But basically, we have Jesus. You have a slightly different origin story for the name, and he's the guy who's the biggest man in the area, and he is king of the Jews, or he tries to be.
Yeah,
and
yeah, very much so.
I must say it's a slightly different version than we get from Religion for Breakfast.
Yes, but only because he's not reading between the lines, because this is exactly what it says in the gospel story. I'm not actually changing the gospel story. It's exactly the same. It's just that we're now interpreting this in royal terms instead of carpenter terms. So we're elevating this story into the political intrigue of that century, essentially. So it's not a religious intrigue with a few paupers and shepherds and God knows what. It's a political intrigue aiming for the throne of Rome. We're going for bust here. We're not even going for the throne of Judea. We're going for the throne of Rome. And the Edessan monarchy, the King IZAS Manu guy, King Jesus Emmanuel, wanted to become not simply the king of Judea, which he had achieved because he was the king of the Jews. He wanted to become the king of Rome, the emperor of Rome. And by AD 66, with all of these shenanigans going on in Rome, everybody knew that Nero was a dead man walking. Now was the time to make your bid. And yes, by AD 66, AD 68, Nero was dead. It was AD 68, wasn't it? AD 68 he died. And the throne of Rome was empty. And so it was open to whoever could grab it. And 4 emperors came and went. We had the year of 4 emperors, with Otho and Galba and various others, all putting their hat in the ring to become the next emperor of Rome.
Their heads sort of got out of the ring, yeah.
Yeah, and being dispatched by the next one, yeah. Until we got down to the last 2. So this wasn't the year of 4 emperors. This was the year of 5 emperors, because it came down to a boxing match, you might say, a civil war between Vespasian and the king of Edessa. And we know that this was being fought by the king of Edessa because Josephus Flavius says so. It was the kings of Adiabene, the kings and the aristocracy of Adiabene, who started the Jewish revolt in AD 66 when they defeated the Roman legion of Cestius. That started the Jewish revolt. I mean, if you defeat a Roman legion, that's a statement of intent. And Rome's not going to forgive it either. The Jewish revolt only ended when these same people surrendered to Titus in AD 70. So we know that this monarchy was involved in and leading this Jewish revolt. So this Jewish revolt between Vespasian and the Adiabene Edessan monarchy was the last battle in the year of 5 emperors. Whoever was going to win this battle was going to become the next emperor of Rome. And we know that that was involved because when the Edessan character lost, Vespasian obviously won this battle. The king of Edessa was crucified while wearing a purple cloak. Now that again is a very pointed reference to the emperor of Rome. You would not dress the Jesus character in a purple cloak unless he was a pretender to the throne of Rome. That's what it means, because the purple cloak was the prerogative of the emperor alone. Nobody else was allowed to wear one. And so they wrapped Jesus in a purple cloak because he was a pretender to the throne of Rome. That's what he wanted, but he lost. He lost this battle to Vespasian. And it was Commander Vespasian. He was a nobody. He had no claim to this throne at all, but the throne was empty. He had just beaten the other defender, the other contender for the throne of Rome. And so now he was the de facto new contender. And so he was given the star prophecy by Josephus Flavius, as Josephus himself says. And remember the star prophecy, which said that the next emperor would be from the east, from Judea. And who had the star prophecy? Who was born under the eastern star? It was the Jesus character. So with the star prophecy, he would now sail to Rome and become the next emperor, which he did. And so that was the true goal of the Edessan monarchy. Judea was just a stepping stone. And so they could step up to the real goal, which was become emperor of Rome.
I think that's important to now move to the next level, is what was made of this story. Because you have the history, which you've uncovered after a fair amount of work and reading between lines and from many sources. But it looks like Christianity was an invention to pacify Jewish people and religious people of Rome as well, with a message of peace, to convert a Roman, a pretender to the throne, to the Prince of Peace, and someone who's only, for the little guy, turn your cheek guy, that guy. He's in there too. I mean, they're both characters here in the Gospels, right? So who made that story up of, the whole story of the lowly shepherd, poor guy, carpenter, becoming, God, basically, is important, I think, for people like that story. I just read Bart Ehrman's confession about his Christmas story that he just reprinted on his blog the other day. And how much Christianity, he's an atheist, he doesn't believe anything, but how much the idea of Christianity means to him politically, in part. He didn't try to say that, but politically, this was an attempt to, it's less top down. We the people down here who have no power, like stories about people who have no power becoming king. This is the slave morality idea also of Nietzsche, right? The whole Jewish intelligentsia and their whole brilliance of making victimhood into a real leverage point. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it seems to be a thing that's there in Christianity really strong. And people like it.
It's a thing in many religions and many organizations. It's the thing in BLM in modern America with Black Lives Matter. We are the oppressed, therefore we have rights. Same with the LBTGHQ, whatever they're called. We are the oppressed, we have rights. The same with Islam. We are the oppressed. It doesn't matter that we've just driven a truck through the Nice promenade, killing 90 people. We only did that because we are oppressed. You've probably heard the story.
Well, yeah, it's about empathy. It gets our sympathy, our pity moving up, and that's an important part of human nature. And but it's also a leverage point in politics. But what I don't know if Josephus or Paul or whoever who concocted this thing quite knew exactly what he was doing, because he seemed to know some things, but did he realize it would take over the Roman Empire?
I don't think he saw it that far in advance, but I mean, he certainly saw his own personal gain from it, because that's what he was looking for. Josephus only looked after one person. Same as Saul, actually. I mean, they're so similar. That's why I say they're the same person. They only looked after one person, and that was themselves. And what they had already set up was just perfect for what the Romans wanted at this stage. So Saul, with his evangelical tours across the Mediterranean, he had gone out evangelizing for the Nazarene. This would have been AD 52, something of that nature, on his first tour of the Mediterranean. And he got beaten up and he got stoned. The message was not well received. He was evangelizing for the Nazarene, which, as I say, I call it an Egypto-Judaism. It wasn't standard Judaism. It was quite different. And he was trying to evangelize for this new type of what Josephus calls the fourth sect of Judaism, which was a messianic, revolutionary type of Judaism that wanted to take over the world. And it was rejected. And so Saul, on his second tour, which would have been AD 55 or something of that nature, he had seen that the Gentiles liked this story. And so he went to James. This was the whole thing about the Council of Jerusalem.
Right.
Coming back to that same Council of Jerusalem again, when they were discussing this bit about circumcision, it was because Saul wanted to become the apostle to the Gentiles. He had already sort of started that process. And so part of the Council of Jerusalem was he went to James, the brother of Jesus, and said, look, can I preach to the Gentiles, the Goyim? And surprisingly, James said yes. And so he gave him the 4 rules of what I call simple Judaism, which was don't eat meat sacrificed to idols, don't drink blood, don't eat strangled animals, and don't commit fornication, which basically fornication means incest, basically, I think, something of that nature. Anyway, that's what it said. So the whole of Leviticus and Deuteronomy all came down to just 4 regulations. So the whole of Mosaic law went out the window. And Saul was given 4 rules for the Gentiles. for Gentile Judaism, simple Judaism, which we today call Christianity. And of course, this was because Saul was a bit of a Romophile, the same as Josephus. This became very Rome friendly because he was preaching within the Roman Empire. Of course, it made much more sense to be Rome friendly. And so the messianic message of Nazarene Judaism went out the window. And so,
but he translated it. I mean, that we get the whole, book of Romans has another messianic story. Isn't that a work of genius?
Yeah, retranslating everything. Yes, putting it around in.
We're not talking about getting a throne in this world. We're talking about, it's being saved. It's an amazing. To me, it's one of the more amazing things that you can get out of this whole story, is what he did with it. Because you concentrate on what he hid, but what he did with it was astounding. People love it still to this day. Christianity is still a very popular religion.
Absolutely. I think in some respects because it's more personal as well. It's about you and your salvation.
Right.
So I don't know. I sort of see the Jewish God as more impersonal, looking after the population of the Jews, the people of the Jews, not so much on a personal basis, whereas Christianity was very much on a personal basis. God will look after you. If you have a problem, God will look after you. And of course, that's very compelling for a lot of people. They want help in their difficult lives because life is difficult. And what you want is a celestial big brother who's looking after you. Very, very popular message.
I notice also that some of the things that, like Jesus says in his instructions on how to pray in the Gospels, is not too dissimilar from some of the magic techniques of those people who believe that what is it? They imagine what you want, and then you materialize it. Or I'm not into magic, so I can't remember these terms. But it does seem similar to me that the Christian idea of prayer, in at least the famous Jesus passage instructing on how to pray, and then it basically says you'll be given it. The prayers will be answered. Which personally, in my experience, when I prayed, I didn't find a lot of personal answers, but others, your experience may vary.
Yeah, but the bottom line is it rang a chord within the populace, and it became very, very popular. So on his second tour, he got a lot of converts, and his religion took off, and it became so powerful, so influential. It outcompeted its parent, and it became a threat to Nazarene Judaism. So people have to remember that Jesus was not a Christian. He was a Nazarene Jew. He was in the losing side on this. So he was in the parent religion, which was now being subsumed by its offspring, which was becoming much more popular around the Mediterranean. And so all of this had been going on since AD 55. So by the time we get to the Jewish revolt, the Saul Josephus character has already had 10 years of evangelizing this particular religion, building up this Rome-friendly form of simple Judaism. And so by the time we get to the end of the Jewish revolt, because the Saul Josephus character, of course, joins the Romans. He changes sides completely and joins the Romans and becomes a Roman army commander, their chief propaganda minister, basically, working in Judea because he understands.
What years do you ascribe to that?
About AD 68.
So when did he become a turncoat? When his group was put under, and was that in AD 68?
Well, it was whenever the Battle of Jotapata was. So actually maybe a bit before that, maybe 67, because the war started in 66. It was halted in 68 when Nero died. So 67 would have been the Battle of Jotapata. And Josephus was the commander, the Judean army commander, defending the city. attacked by the Romans, attacked by Vespasian and Titus. And after a 32-day siege or something, the Romans stormed the city. All of the people fled and were killed, and Josephus retired to a dungeon somewhere with about 30 of his compatriots. And so he's in this dungeon, and he wants to surrender to the Romans. And of course, his soldiers won't let him. He's supposed to be their commander. So he devises this wonderful scheme where they draw lots to see who will kill the other. So they all commit suicide. And Josephus just happens to be the last man standing. I think what he did, I think that the simplest method for this was that he drew the lots. And so as the commander who was drawing the lots, he was the last man standing. And so there was just him and one other who could surrender to the Romans. And of course, he's even laughing at the people, their stupidity, that he's the last man standing. And so he surrenders to the Romans. And he's put in prison for a while, probably for about, I don't know, 6 months, maybe 9 months, until, because an odd thing happens at this point. Vespasian is expecting Josephus to surrender to him. And he's annoyed with Josephus that he took so long to do so. I think Josephus had been working for the Romans ever since his trip to go and see Nero, because things had been brewing in Judea for quite some time, a decade or more. And of course, what Rome wanted was eyes and ears on the ground in Judea. Now, who better to do that than Josephus Flavius? Someone who understood Judaism, was linked obviously somehow to the royal families and the aristocracy there, who understood what was going on, understood the religion, and could tell the Romans what on earth was happening in Judea. I think the Saul Josephus character had been working for the Romans ever since his visit to Rome in AD 62. So he was a Roman spy. That's why Josephus knew all about him. That's why he was expecting him to surrender. And so after a short while in prison, Josephus was elevated to becoming the chief propaganda minister for the Roman army, trying to get the Jews in Jerusalem during the siege of Jerusalem to surrender. And afterwards, because of course they were defeated, afterwards he was given enormous privileges by Vespasian and Titus. You know, there are some critics out there who don't seem to know what on earth they're talking about, who say that, what do they say? They say that the Edessan monarchy were allies of Rome, even though they were fighting against Rome, overtly fighting against Rome, and surrendering to Rome and being sent to Rome in chains, that somehow they are allies. I don't understand that one. And they also say that Josephus was a slave of the Romans. And you think, hold on a minute, he was working for the Romans as a propaganda minister, as a Roman army commander. And then after the Jewish revolt, he was given leave to free anyone of his family and his friends. And so he freed about 150 people who were his immediate compatriots. He was given, with all of their wealth restored to his family. So his family did very well from this. And he was given lands because his lands in Jerusalem were confiscated, because Jerusalem was no longer a Jewish city. It became Capitolina or something. It became a Roman city anyway, and no Jew was allowed in the city. So to compensate him, he was given lands down on the plain, which were probably actually better than at Jerusalem, at Yabni, south of modern Tel Aviv. And so he was rewarded quite handsomely. And plus he became the chief historian and scribe to Vespasian, writing all of the history of this region. But I think he was also given Yabni, which became it became the new Sanhedrin, because obviously the Sanhedrin had been abandoned and disbanded on the command of Vespasian, because the last thing that he wanted was the Messianic Jews back in control again. And so they re-established a new Sanhedrin down at Yabni, just south of Tel Aviv, down on the coast. That's where Josephus had his new lands and his new vineyards. But of course, the Sanhedrin was known as a vineyard because of all the priests in their rows of desks looked like rows of vines in a vineyard. I think that Josephus was controlling the new Sanhedrin. Therefore, he was the de facto king of the Jews, or high priest of the Jews, in the post-revolt era. I think that was his role. So he was very, very influential in the post-revolt era, plus writing all of the histories of Judaism and the history of the Jewish revolt as well. Yeah, he was not a slave. He was a very powerful person in the post-revolt era.
I don't remember if we talked about it before. This is Eusebius I have in my hand, the history of the church. People might be wondering about Abgarus and some of the characters. There is, that famous letter that purports to be to and from Jesus.
Yes.
That Eusebius recognizes as he thought it was authentic. That's another one of those many funny things that you discover when you start reading history, rather than just learning what you learn from an expert, because we've always been told Jesus was illiterate. We've even heard that from people, that he an absurd idea, and that we have no writings from him. He was like Socrates, right? No writings from him. Well, this may be, the story, the letter in Eusebius is not very good history, but it is tying Jesus to Abgarus and Abgarus's problem that was to be solved at the very event that you're talking about, right?
That is interesting, because we get three versions of that story. We get the Doctrine of Addai, we get the version by Eusebius, which is virtually the same, and we get Moses of Corinne, who writes a similar story. And it's all about Edessa. And remember, Eusebius lived in Edessa. It's not as if he didn't know what was happening in Edessa, which is, it makes it doubly more interesting that Edessa has been deleted from history if Eusebius actually lived in that town, because, that's why he's writing about the Doctrine of Addai. And yeah, this is another story, and it's another story, as I was saying before, about the Council of Jerusalem. It's about ambassadors from Edessa being sent down to Jerusalem to go and see Jesus. And of course, these ambassadors included Hanan, who is Ananias from Antiquities. It's the same person. And he's either called Hanan or Anan. The only slight difference, I suppose you might say, is the inference in this document is that he was the ambassador of Edessa, and he was being sent down to Jerusalem. Whereas if you read Antiquities, it sounds like he was in Jerusalem and he was being sent up to Edessa. The Doctrine of Addai says it the other way around. But anyway, they go off down to see Jesus because the king is infirm. Again, we're probably talking about the wounded king again, that he was wounded between the thighs. It's either talking about circumcision or it's talking about castration, because of the conversion of the royalty to Judaism. But it has some interesting asides to it, because we get these letters coming back from Jesus. Now, the letters, a couple of interesting things. Well, the letters themselves, I don't think are real, because if you read them, they're Christian propaganda from Eusebius, basically. The interesting thing is that this has to happen for religious purposes, for gospel purposes, it has to happen during the reign of Tiberius, to be in the AD 30s, for Jesus to be alive. But they go and see the Syrian procurator, the governor of Syria, and they get the wrong governor. So the governor they give is an AD 40s, AD 50s governor. So Eusebius was so shoddy in his workmanship that while he changed the name of the emperor to Tiberius, when it should have been obviously Claudius, for the to be associated with the Council of Jerusalem, and for everything else that was going on, it had to be Emperor Claudius. So Eusebius has changed the emperor to Tiberius, but forgot to change the governor of Syria. And so we get this dichotomy in the chronology again. But
it's another huge clue that you might be right? I mean, yeah. This is a clue. This is not just a contradiction as such. It's a contradiction with the smoking barrel.
Because the story is quite obviously talking about the Council of Jerusalem again. It's the same story. But in this case, he's writing to Jesus. So the inference from this is that the Jesus character, so we can almost date this again to the AD 50s. They are writing to the king, and the king is obviously the old king. This would be Abgarus, the king from AD 4-ish up to AD 50, the king of Edessa. Now, the son at this time was obviously down in Judea. That's why they're writing to Jesus, who happens to be down in Judea. Why is he writing to Jesus? Well, because he's his son. This is why he wants a painting, because they sent Hanan not only to write to Jesus and see him and see how he's doing, but they want a painting of him. So Hanan makes a painting. Now, in the more fanciful version by Eusebius, it's a miraculous painting on a cloth. So Jesus wipes his face with a cloth, and somehow his image becomes imprinted on the cloth. And this is the famous cloth of Veronica, of course, which goes to Edessa and is hidden in the walls of Edessa. But in the more prosaic story of the doctrine of Addai, it's a painting using the choicest of paints that Hanan draws a picture of Jesus because his father wants a picture of his son, and to see how he's doing down in Judea, because he's obviously doing some expansion of the royal family down in Judea. I mean, that was the whole point in being there. That's why when the king died, that Jesus had to have the anointing by Mary Magdalene, at the house of Simon, not in a palace, because he wasn't there at the time. He was elsewhere. But of course, he had to anoint himself very quickly, because if you're not careful, someone else back in Edessa will anoint themselves instead. And then you'll end up with a contention about who's going to be the next king. So you've always got to jump in quickly here, otherwise you'll lose your position. So again, that sort of ties in very nicely with the story of Jesus being absent from Edessa at this time.
We probably cover the territory to some lengthy degree. We're over 2 hours, I think. So,
probably yes. But just as a quick roundup for this, for viewers and listeners, you see how all of the components fit together. This is why I like this theory that I've teased out over 30 more years. I started 40 years ago. Is that all the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle fit together very nicely. It's not a claim in isolation. If I was saying, Jesus was just the king of Edessa. Well, yeah, thanks. Okay. No evidence, This is not that simple claim. It is a claim which is backed up by numerous side issues, which all point towards the same conclusion. And by numerous, I'm probably talking about several hundred different aspects of the story that all point together towards this being an Edessan story about the Jewish revolt and not about a carpenter in the AD 30s. So we have this 40-year chronological chasm, as I call it, between the classical date and my revised Jewish revolt date of AD 66 to AD 70. But all of these components of this story all match up to this being a Jewish revolt story that was taken by the Romans. And as you were saying earlier, perhaps we just sort of should clarify that, was taken by the Romans because Saul Josephus already had this religion in his bag. It was a part of his anyway, I was forgetting what I was saying there. It was already
part of his repertory of myth. I mean, he was
yes, and absolutely. That's what I was looking for. Yeah, he had this repertoire already up and running. It was already very popular. It was already very popular amongst the Gentiles. It was most definitely pro-Roman, and therefore it was anti. Well, in fact, it was also very obviously anti the Messianic Judaism of the Nazarene Jews. So it was non-revolutionary, it was pro-Roman, it turned the other cheek, it said you must pay your Roman taxes. It was everything that an emperor of Rome ever wanted out of a new religion, especially if this religion could supplant the old religion of Messianic Judaism. So it was just perfect for the Romans to pick up and run with as being the new method of pacifying Messianic Judaism and Judea in general. And it worked. And we call that religion today, we call it Christianity. And that was the birth of Christianity. And so this story had to go. They couldn't really exclude this story and exclude the characters from this story because they were central to this religion, which had already been going for more than, 15 years by this time. It was already in the bag. And so the best thing they could do with it is to cover who these characters really were. So the Jesus character is relegated from being king to being a pauper prince of peace, from being, down to being a shepherd, which is talking about the procession of the zodiac, but we can't go into that. So it's the same story. The funny thing about this is after changing all of these aspects, the story remains exactly the same, pretty much. It's still a gospel story, except it's just changed into a Rome-friendly form of Judaism, which is talking about the Jewish revolt, but covered it up so successfully that you would never think that this was actually talking about the Jewish revolt. And it's a lovely story of peace and reconciliation for Rome, so that Rome doesn't have any more revolts on the eastern borders of its empire, which didn't quite work, of course, because we then had the Bar Kokhba uprising. But other than that, it was absolutely perfect for Rome. And that's why it was picked up and promoted by Rome. And the only persecution at that time was not against the simple Judaism of Saul and Josephus. It was against the Messianic Jews, what they call the, what do they call them? They call them the Jewish Christians, the Nazarenes, the fourth sect of Judaism. They were the people who were being persecuted by the Roman emperors in the 70s and 80s, not the simple Judaic Church of Jesus and James. So this is a theory that explains everything. All of the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle fit into place.
Well, very good. That gives us a lot to think about. I think about it all the time. This has certainly been an interesting several years here as I look up your sources and see if I can see what contradictions I can find, see what problems I can find. I haven't found too many, so that's why I have you here for the third time.
As I was saying to Robert Price recently when I was on one of his interviews, It is only a theory. It's a theory that works very well. Theories need challenging, of course. So people need to look in to see whether there are holes. And I'm sure, you know, with the amount of work I've actually written, that there will be one or two holes there. But new theories also need nurturing as well. So they need other eyes on the subject who will have a different view and will have read different things, of course, that might even add to the story. So it needs a bit of both. It needs challenging, but it also needs nurturing, because I think there's a lot of potential in this theory.
This has been great. I really enjoy listening to you. I've enjoyed you on other podcasts as well. I didn't think that I would be into nutrient nirvana. I think that's
Yes.
It's not a channel that I would normally go to, but I've enjoyed your talks there as well.
Yes, it's been very popular on his channel. So yeah, and thank you very much for having me back on your channel again. Thanks, Timothy.
Thanks.